So sometimes we can hear familiar stories like this and kind of take them, oh yeah, we know what that's all about, right? And this story in John 21 is not just a little sweet little resurrection story. In fact, I found three things. I'm going to be honest with you. I found three things that I had not thought of before. So never stop reading the same things over and over again. But this is a story that happens after failure, about the difference between self-preservation and love, in a story about the cost of new life. So Peter's part in today's story began several days before it, right? It begins in a courtyard around a charcoal fire while Jesus is being questioned. And Peter denies Jesus 3 times because he's afraid for his life. He's trying to save his own skin. He says, I don't know him. 3 times. That's what his betrayal was. Not confusion, not theological uncertainty, just self-preservation. Fear closing in over faith. That desperate instinct to survive, even if it means distancing himself from Jesus. And John is too good of a storyteller to let us miss what happens next. Because if you notice in this chapter, in these verses that we read, when Jesus meets Peter again, what are they sitting by? A charcoal fire. The only 2 times, by the way, that John talks about a fire being a charcoal fire. At Peter's denial and at the beach. Now, why would that happen? I mean, think about it. It's the same kind of fire. There's the same smell in the air, right? Smell is really a strong memory thing, right? So Peter's body would place that memory of denial around a charcoal fire. And so this is not an accident, it seems. The whole story is about Jesus taking Peter back to the place of his failure, not to shame him, but to heal what happened there. But here's one of the other things, because before any of that can happen, Peter goes fishing. Which on one level is about fish, but on another level, it is not about fish at all. This is not a recreational outing. Peter's not going, I just need to spend some time on the water. This is Peter doing what people do when life and expectations and hopes have blown up. Or when they failed, or when they don't know what's going to happen next. And when suddenly the old life looks very merciful. So he goes back to what he knows, back to what his hands remember, back to the identity that existed before Jesus ever said, follow me. And honestly, it makes perfect sense. Because when the future feels strange, most of us reach for something familiar. And that is where I need to confess something to you. There are parts of that instinct that I do not understand inside myself. I am a Methodist pastor. I get moved every few years. Change isn't an interruption to my life, it's one of the recurring facts of it. I moved from parsonage to parsonage, so I don't really have a home in the way many of you do. And so when I hear, especially some of the older folks, say that they refuse to go to a nursing home because they want to die in this house. And I understand the words. I don't get them, though. Because I don't feel the same way about places that you might. So I am very slow to talk as though I fully understand what it means to be in one place. To do the same things, to know the same people for decades. There's a kind of rootedness there that is, to me, both beautiful and entirely foreign. And that's one of the things I actually like about serving rural and village churches, because I get to pastor a people whose lives are full of continuity. People who know land and season and repair and routine and the weight of life built in one place. I also know this about you. At your core, you are a pragmatic people. No nonsense. If something at home breaks, a mower, a refrigerator, an oven, if you're of the farming type, a tractor, and it can't be fixed, what do? Not a trick question. I swear to God, it's not a trick question. What do? You get a new one, right? Will it hurt? Of course it will. Will it cost you? Yep. Do you buy a new one anyway? Yep. Yes, sir, Bob, because the work still has to be done, right? And the old broken thing doesn't do the job. You know that. You live that. You don't romanticize a dead tractor. you may have fond memories of it, but it's still not doing the job. You don't keep a broken oven out of sentiment and then suddenly act shocked when dinner doesn't cook, right? And yet church people can know that very fact in everyday life, then walk into a church and act like familiar but fruitless. Let's call it fruitless. That the familiar and fruitless is somehow holier than the new and the useful. And not because you're foolish, but it's also because church touches deep parts of us. It touches memory and loss and identity and love. And once those things get involved, we can start treating self-preservation like faithfulness. Peter knows everything about that. Because when Peter goes back to the old life, notice what happens. Do you remember what happens? Nothing. They caught nothing. They fished all night and caught nothing. I think that's one of the most amazing details of the whole story. Peter goes back to what is familiar, what once fed him, once told him who he was, and it bears no fruit. The old life offered comfort, but not actual life. It offered competence, but not calling. It offered familiarity, but not future. And then I think that's the insult added to the injury. That the old life keeps offering familiarity as though it were enough, and then it just leaves you empty-handed. And morning comes, Jesus is on the shore. They don't recognize him yet, of course. I don't know why still. And he tells them to cast the net on the other side. As though to say, you've been going that way the whole time when you should be going that way. And suddenly the nets fill. And the beloved disciple says, it's the Lord. And Peter, in classic Peter fashion, throws himself into the sea. Because of course he does, right? This is Peter. Peter is very many things, but measured is not one of them. And then comes that part where we can become undone, I think, that when they get to the shore, Jesus already has breakfast going. Bread, fish, fire, morning. He doesn't begin with a lecture. He begins with breakfast. As though he's saying, in effect, you must be hungry. Come on and eat. And that matters because Jesus doesn't restore Peter through humiliation. He restores him by feeding him. Jesus isn't avoiding Peter's failure. He's just refusing to begin there. And now we're back at that charcoal fire, right? Back at the place where Peter once tried to save himself. 3 times Jesus asks, do you love me? 3 times. Not because Jesus is cruel, not because he enjoys making Peter squirm, I think, but because Peter's wound has a shape. And grace is patient enough to address it in that same shape. 3 denials, 3 questions, 3 commissions. There's even something like teshuvah, repentance in it, right? Undoing what has been done. So Peter begins to undo with words of love the damage he did with words of denial. Do you love me? Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Notice that Jesus does not erase the past. He doesn't pretend the denial never happened. He doesn't hand Peter a clean slate with no memory attached to it. He gives him a future. And then Jesus says something I think that's even harder. He tells Peter about the kind of death he's going to die. And please don't miss the contrast. Peter's denial was about self-preservation. His restoration ends with the exact opposite. Not saving his own skin, but spending his life in love. That's the turn. That's the whole turn. The first time Jesus said, follow me, it took Peter away from the very familiar nets and boats and toward the very unfamiliar future. And now Jesus says it again, after failure, after denial, after breakfast. And it does the same thing. It takes Peter away from the old familiar things, the boats and the nets, toward a future that's not only unfamiliar, but it's also outright dangerous. And notice where Jesus places that call, by the way. I don't know if you caught this. This was one of those things where I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. He says it. He says, follow me, right after he tells Peter that someone else will one day dress him and lead him where he does not wish to go. And then it says, follow me. As though Jesus is saying, I am the one who will lead you to the place you do not wish to go. I am the one calling you into a life you would not choose on your own. So when Jesus says, follow me, I don't think he means stay where it's safe. I think he means come with me, not backward, not towards self-protection, but towards love, towards sheep, towards a life that will no longer be governed by the question, how do I preserve myself? And that's where this quote that I came across recently suddenly rang very true. I don't even know the source. It's attributed to an author, but there's also a lot of debate about it. But it's a quote, and this is it. It says, of course, everything is falling apart. Your new life will cost you your old one. That's not just a clever sentence. That's John 21, 1 through 19, in a nutshell. Peter does not get his old life back with some kind of spiritual glow to it. He gets a different life altogether, a life in which his old reflexes of self-preservation are slowly replaced by love. A life in which failure is not the end, but neither is it left untouched. A life in which Jesus doesn't say, go back to what you were. He says, come, follow me. And I think this is where it should land on us, not as a scolding, but as a truthful question. What in our lives do we keep preserving because it's familiar, even though it no longer works? What in us still wants Christianity to function like self-preservation? What in us still wants church to be mostly keeping what we know and maintaining what we can predict and staying near the old boats because at least we know how to use them? And please hear me very carefully. This is not me saying that every old thing is broken and every new thing is holy. That's just silliness. Some old things are beautiful. Some old forms still bear enormous life. And some new ideas are just trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, as they say, right? Old or new is not the point. The point is fruit. The point is calling. The point is whether the thing still helps us do the work that Jesus has given us. Farmers know this. Small town people know this. If it still works, if it still bears weight, if it still does the job, then use it with gratitude. But if it's dead, if it can't be fixed, if the work keeps failing because the tool no longer does the job, then keeping it is not stewardship, it's stubbornness. And I know that's a hard word, but it's not a mean one. It's just honest. Because I think sometimes in church life we fight changes we would accept without blinking anywhere else in our lives. Not because we're especially spiritual, but because church sits closer to our rhythms and our grief and our memory and our fear. And again, I say that as someone who knows I do not feel that kind of stuff the way you do. My life has trained me for motion. Yours has trained you for rootedness. And I'm not interested in mocking that at all. Because rootedness can be grace. Can also be an excuse. Peter's boats were things, not evil. And they no longer served his future. And if you only take one sentence away from the sermon, maybe just take that one. His boats are things, not evils. And they were no longer his future. And the same may be true of us, within us or among us. Things that aren't wicked, they're not fake, they're not meaningless, they're just no longer the future Jesus is calling us toward. And then comes that final echo from Jesus himself when he says, "Follow me." Jesus' last words to Peter are the first words he had with him. After all the failure, after all the denial, after the empty nets, after the breakfast, after the questions, after naming the costly future ahead, Jesus says, "Follow me." Again. Which means the story doesn't end with Peter's shame, it ends with a call, with a man who once tried to preserve himself, now being called into a life that will be marked by self-sacrifice. So maybe the practice this week that I'm giving you, it won't be a list of questions or things to consider. Okay, not a list of questions, maybe just one question. One hard, pragmatic, honest question. Why do I fight against replacing the broken, useless things at church when at home I don't bat an eye about it? All right, maybe one more. Where is Jesus already standing on the shore? Not to humiliate you, but to feed you into your next act of faithfulness. Because that's the shape of grace here, right? Breakfast, truth, calling, and then in the end, not safety, not certainty, certainly not self-preservation, but definitely self-sacrifice. And the last word is not mine, it is Christ's. When he says, "Follow me." Amen.